Calgary, where I'm speaking from tonight. I'm Carolyn Music, Chair of Christian Thought. Before we start with the official proceedings, I would like to go over some basic points related to tonight's talk. The talk will last around 40 minutes, and there will be about 20 minutes for questions from you, the audience. And this is a webinar, and you will have the ability to ask questions by typing them into a question and answer box that should be on the bottom of your screen, I believe. When we are ready for questions after the talk, these will be read out by Monique, one of our technical hosts. The presentation is being recorded and it is planned to be uploaded onto the Department of Classics and Religion website, the YouTube station, I should say, in the near future. And Courtney, our other magnificent host tonight, technical host, will be able to send you a link. Anybody who has signed up for tonight's talk will receive a link for where that can be found. So I will now start officially with tonight's event. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Now, as I previously mentioned, I'm Carolyn Music. I am newly arrived at the University of Calgary, where I've just taken up the post Chair of Christian Thought in the Department of Classics and Religion. And this is my first time hosting as Chair of Christian Thought, and it is my pleasure to warmly welcome you, the audience, to this event. And I'm also delighted that the first speaker I'm hosting is Dr. Kristin Kobes Du Mez from Calvin University in Michigan, where Dr. Du Mez will be speaking from tonight. Dr. Du Mez, as you saw in the holding screen, received her PhD from the University of Notre Dame. Her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. And this is brilliantly illustrated in her most recent book, which I have here, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, which is a wonderful book I've been reading over the last few days. It's about masculinity from the Cold War to the present, culminating in the election of Donald Trump. In fact, Dr. Du Mez will be giving the Chair of Christian Thought Iwaza lecture on Saturday, this Saturday, the 24th of October at 2:30 p.m. online through the Calgary Public Library, where she will talk about this wonderful book. And there is still time to register for this lecture via the Calgary Public Library page. Now, another thing I want to focus on just right now in this introduction is that in addition to Dr. Du Mez's scholarly accomplishments in the academy, she demonstrates very effectively, I think, how academic research can help make sense and bring meaning and understanding to some of our most pressing challenges in today's world. And this is reflected in the various venues that she has published in. Dr. Du Mez has written for the Washington Post, Religion News Service, Christianity Today, Christian Century. She has been interviewed on NPR, CTV, CBC, BBC, all the letters of the alphabet you can think of. The list goes on. Now, in these last weeks leading up to the election, the American election, Dr. Du Mez, I know, has been very busy. I see all this activity on YouTube and interviews, and we are very lucky that she's able to be here tonight, given the proximity to the election and also the presidential debate that is just starting now. But I can assure you that Dr. Du Mez's talk will be much more illuminating. So tonight, Dr. Du Mez's talk is entitled, Why We Want to Kill You, Islamophobia in American Evangelicalism. Dr. Du Mez, I would like to virtually welcome you to the University of Calgary.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And thank you to the University of Calgary, to the Department of Classics and Religion, and to so many of you who have worked to make this possible. And yes, I think I'd rather be here with you virtually than downstairs watching my television and watching the debate. I think this will be a more edifying experience. So again, it's a delight to be here with you. And thank you for tuning in. So let me start by saying I did not set out to write about Islamophobia, not at all. I wanted to study white evangelical conceptions of masculinity. What does it mean to be a Christian man? Now, I was first drawn to the topic of evangelical masculinity when a couple of my students handed me this book. If you haven't read it, no problem. Some of you might recognize it right away. This is John Eldridge's book, Wild at Heart, Discovering the Secret of a Man's Soul. Now, the book came out in 2001, but my students handed it to me right around in 2005, I think it was. And I had just been lecturing on Teddy Roosevelt in US history. And I explained how gender worked in history. And it was so interesting because it was linked to economic shifts, and it was linked to religion, and it was linked to ideas of nation and American power. And all of these things that I thought, Calvin University students really needed to learn. And after that class, a couple guys said, Professor Du Mez, you really need to read this book. And so I did, and I knew exactly what they were talking about. The book opens with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and it goes on to present this elaborate vision of Christian manhood as essentially militant, militaristic. God is a warrior God, and every man is made in his image. Every man needs a battle to fight. Now, I was rather shocked by this because what was interesting to me is evangelicals like to tout themselves as being Bible-believing Christians, but in fact, there weren't a lot of Bible verses in this book. Instead, it really drew on a kind of mythical history of warriors and soldiers and cowboys. So I was really curious about this, and I wanted to discover, where did this come from? So as a historian, I started to look back in time and try to trace back to the origins of this really militant, militaristic conception of Christian manhood. And I ended back in the Cold War era, back in the late 1940s, 1950s, when these things started to come together. At that point, evangelicals were strongly anti-communist. They believed that communism was anti-God, anti-family, and anti-American, all of the things that they loved. And in the early Cold War era, they thought that this threat, the communist threat, demanded a military response. So evangelicals, just as they were trying to kind of consolidate their power, reassert their strength in American society, came together and became pro-war, pro-military, and they promoted an aggressive foreign policy in defense of God and country. They thought it was their duty to protect Christianity and to protect Christianity. And because they considered themselves the most devout Christians, they had the special role to play in America at the time. And so in the late 40s, 1950s, we see Christian nationalism really taking a hold within American evangelical circles. Now, quick word that it's hard to kind of see this as something new and exciting given what has happened since, but things hadn't always been that way. At previous moments, not all conservative Protestants were Christian nationalists, not by any stretch. Many conservative Protestants actually were pacifists and rejected militarism. And if you go back further in time, we'll see also their conceptions of masculinity were also really quite different. So as a historian, it's important to point out change over time. Now, evangelicals, in holding together all of these values, really weren't all that different from many Americans. This was the consensus era, Cold War consensus, and a lot of Americans shared these values until the 1960s. Then we have the anti-war movement, threatening to undermine American security, at least in the minds of many Americans who believed that you needed a strong military to defend against communism. And with the Vietnam War in particular, this was really destabilizing to American society generally, but it was concerning to conservative evangelicals in particular. What was wrong with American boys that they couldn't defeat this ragtag enemy of North Vietnamese? And the answer to that problem was, to many evangelicals and many conservatives generally, feminism, right? That feminism was somehow emasculating American men because to defend the nation and all that Americans held dear, and again, this required a military response, you needed very strong militant men. That was their role. And why couldn't we beat the Vietnamese? Clearly, there was something wrong with American manhood. And so you see in this moment, conservatives and conservative evangelicals in particular embracing a kind of traditional militant masculinity and embracing that in the context of Christian nationalism and in the context of Cold War militarism, at the moment when many other Americans were abandoning these values, embracing feminism, rethinking American power, American goodness, and American greatness. And so it's at this point that we really see conservative evangelicals becoming the church militant. They became uncritically pro-war, very pro-military, which was also a new thing. Up in the Second World War, the military was seen as a place where young boys could be corrupted. It was not a wholesome place. That really starts to change. They embrace at home law and order politics with all the racial connotations that come with that, and then a broad, aggressive foreign policy. And this is what really unites conservative evangelicals with the Republican Party. And this is really what spawns the rise of the religious right, that kind of alliance. Okay, but then the Cold War came to an end. So we're kind of going to fast forward a little bit. By the late 80s, early 90s, this old order and the kind of the center of evangelicals' cultural identity and political identity that had been framed in this Cold War moment comes to an end, and old certainties are gone. And if you pay attention to what conservative evangelicals, white evangelicals were saying in the early 1990s, the word that comes up over and over again is confusion. So much confusion. What do we do on the global stage anymore? We're not fighting the Cold War. So it's kind of up for grabs. We have a flourishing of a lot of Christians are focused on the persecuted church at this time, or alleviating global poverty. This is when we see the rise of compassionate conservatism within the Republican Party, and many evangelicals embracing that. Now, this also created a crisis when it came to masculinity, because the Cold War model, this militant, strong, rugged, violent when necessary masculinity, also didn't seem like a great fit with the end of the Cold War. Plus, feminism seemed here to stay. Women were in the workplace. So there was a lot of experimentation within evangelical circles around gender roles too. This is when we have the rise of the evangelical men's movement. Maybe you've heard of the Promise Keepers movement, if you moved in those circles at all. This just swept through the nation. Millions of men participated in this men's movement, meeting at stadiums around the country, a march on Washington, D.C., and men were coming together to learn what it meant to be a Christian man. Now, at this time, there were a lot of different answers within the evangelical men's movement as far as what that looked like. But generally, it was much more emotive, kind of focusing on compassion, on fatherhood, but they still didn't abandon the patriarchy that had always been a part of evangelical masculinity. So what they start talking about is their favorite motif is that of the tender warrior. So you still have the warrior. You still got to be ready to fight. That's a man's job. Protector, protect faith, family, nation. But you need to be tender. You need to be gentle, and you need to be able to hold that together. And that really characterizes the evangelical men's movement. It's a time of confusion, and the tender warrior kind of holds it together. Not all conservatives are happy with this. Not all conservative evangelicals are. And by the second half of the 1990s, you see this growing dissatisfaction with tenderness. The emotion had just gone a little too far. Within conservative evangelicalism, you also have dissatisfaction with kind of this retreat from more militant conservative politics that had been framed in the Cold War era. So you have a new war declared. Pat Buchanan declared a culture war, a war for the soul of America. And so that's brewing during this time too, all of which leads to a kind of backlash. The pendulum swings away from tenderness, because you don't want tenderness in the trenches, and back towards a more rugged, more militant masculinity by the end of the decade. And you start to see a lot of complaints about Promise Keepers all of a sudden. It's too soft, it's too effeminate. And so 3 books appear at the end of the 1990s. Actually, 2001 is when they appear. One is John Eldridge's Wild at Heart. Another is James Dobson's Bringing Up Boys. And the third is Doug Wilson's Future Men. And all of these present a much more rugged and explicitly militant, militaristic conception of masculinity. Now, these books line the Christian bookshelves when terrorists strike the United States on September 11, 2001. They had just been out for months. Suddenly, every man has a battle to fight was not just metaphorical, right? There's a real battle. And these books are going to resonate far and wide with American evangelicals and with Americans generally. So in the post 9/11 era, we see people returning to Cold War categories. The moral certainties of the war on terror put an end to this time of confusion. In the days after September 11, President Bush spoke of ridding the world of evildoers, and he warned Americans that this crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while. Maybe you remember that. A lot of Americans found this rhetoric disturbing, and he soon walked this back within a day or two. But for evangelicals, this language made perfect sense because Islam had just instantly replaced communism as the enemy of all that was good. The Muslims have become the modern day equivalent of the evil empire, explained the National Association of Evangelicals, Richard Cizik. Now, evangelicals' pro-Israel sympathies had already situated them in a particular way and had fueled anti-Muslim sentiments earlier. And then in the 1990s, when they were focusing on the global persecution of Christians, often that focus ended up looking at Islamic countries and the persecution of minority Christians there. And so that also played into that. But then after September 11, you see this long history of Christian Zionism and heightened concern about the persecution of Christians at the hands of Muslims. This all becomes intertwined with a new defense of Christian America, defense against Islamic radicalism. Here again, we're going to see concern about foreign affairs, just like in the Cold War era, is going to be intimately linked to conceptions of masculinity. As Phyllis Schlafly put it at the time, one of the consequences of the terror attacks was the dashing of feminist hopes to make America gender neutral or androgynous society. When the firemen charged up the stairs, the death tally was men 343, women 0. Fighting the Taliban was a job for real men. Fortunately, a warrior culture had survived 30 years of feminist assaults, so a few men were macho enough to still want to kill the bad guys in the world. Now, again, these books already lined the shelves of Christian bookstores, and they sold like crazy. John Eldridge's book sold more than 4 million copies. And this literature positioned evangelicals to respond in particular ways: pro-war, pro-preemptive war in general, condone the use of torture. All these surveys are coming out that white evangelicals are just outliers on all of these issues. In 2002, evangelical leaders sent a letter to President Bush to assure him that a preemptive war on Iraq would be totally cool and aligned with just war principles. Ordinary evangelicals, too, are the biggest backers of the war in Iraq. 87% supported Bush's decision compared to 59% of secular Americans. They were steeped in an image of God as a warrior God and extremely receptive to sentiments like Jerry Falwell Sr. in his 2004 sermon, God is pro-war. They had long idealized cowboys and soldiers as models of Christian manhood, and so they embraced Bush's cowboy approach and his Lone Ranger mentality. Now, this renewed militarism is reflected in a very close relationship that developed between evangelicals and the US military, focused in Colorado Springs. It's kind of a remarkable story. James Dobson's focus on the family, headquarters right across the highway from the Air Force Academy. Ted Haggard's New Life Church is right there, and they have all of these partnerships going on. But it also gave rise to a virulent Islamophobia. Billy Graham's son Franklin called Islam a very evil and wicked religion. Pat Robertson told his viewers that Muslims were worse than Nazis. James Dobson made clear that Islamic fundamentalism was one of the most serious threats to the American family, because the security of our children, of our families and children, is, after all, a family value. Ted Haggard said that spiritual warfare required a virile, worldly counterpart, lest his kids grew up in an Islamic state. In the fall of 2002, 77% of evangelical leaders had an unfavorable view of Islam. 70% agreed that Islam was a religion of violence. 2/3 believed that Islam was dedicated to world domination. Now, these views were espoused by leaders, but then they were also promoted throughout American evangelicalism through popular culture. Christian bookstores soon were filled with books with titles like From Iraq to Armageddon, or Iran, the Coming Crisis, The Islamic Invasion, and American Heroes in the Fight Against Radical Islam. Oliver North, you've probably heard of him before, from the Iran-Contra scandal in the 1980s. You probably didn't know that he went on to become a best-selling author, and he penned a few works of fiction as well. And he and his co-author, Chuck Holton, sometimes they publish separately, sometimes together, published all sorts of books depicting Muslims as vicious and set on attacking godly Americans. In his 2009 novel, Meltdown, one of Chuck Holton's characters kind of gives voice to his perspective, dismissed the suggestion that there might be any peaceful Muslims in America. He certainly wasn't seeing any. Now, evangelicals like Holton and North turned to fiction to stir up fear of radical Islam. But other evangelicals at this time were peddling fiction as fact to stoke fears of Islam. And this is where things get interesting. In the years after 9/11, we have the curious case of ex-Muslim terrorists who took the evangelical speaking circuit by storm. The most influential of these ex-Muslim terrorists, air quotes all around these all, were Ergen and Emil Connor, whose 2002 book, Unveiling Islam, an insider's look at Muslim life and beliefs, was a runaway bestseller in evangelical circles. Now, the Connor brothers told how they had converted to Christianity out of Islam in their teens after attending a Baptist revival. They ended up at Criswell College, where they met Paige Patterson, who would go on to be president of the Southern Baptist Convention, one of the most important figures in conservative evangelicalism for decades. And it was Patterson who actually convinced them to write this book, Unveiling Islam. In that book, from their first-person experience, they told of the bloody history of Islam and how violence was absolutely at the heart of the Islamic faith, and how they had been inspired by 9/11 to reveal this history to Americans and to American Christians. Muslims, however, quickly started raising red flags, pointing out half-truth after half-truth, misinterpretations, mischaracterizations, and just plain out lies that filled the pages of this immensely popular book. Now, inspired by this book, uh, Jerry Vines, a former president of the SBC, Southern Baptist Convention, denounced Islam in provocative language. He called Islam's founder a demon-possessed pedophile. His response drew criticism, but Jerry Falwell jumped to his defense. And then before long, Falwell joined in and he called Muhammad a terrorist. Falwell's remarks unleashed a global furor. The Iranian foreign minister condemned his comments for sparking war among civilizations. The British foreign secretary denounced them, and in India and Kashmir, protests erupted, leaving 8 people dead. Falwell then hired Ergen Connor to teach at Liberty University, and he continued to tell tales of Islamic terror. The more he spoke, the more he embellished his stories, until Muslim and Christian bloggers began to dispute his claims. He hadn't, in fact, grown up in Turkey as he had claimed. He had been born in Sweden, and at age 3, moved to Ohio. His parents divorced, and so he was raised by a Swedish Lutheran mother. He'd never been involved in Islamic jihad. He had not bravely debated dozens of Muslims, and his thick Middle Eastern accent was a complete sham. He got basic facts about Islam completely wrong. And these bloggers really kept after him and kept after Liberty University. In 2010, the spring, Liberty conducted an investigation, but they declined to take any action, concluding that he had done, quote, nothing theologically inappropriate. Not about to let facts get in the way of a greater truth. It was right at this time that Focus on the Family decided to rerun a 2001 interview with Connor that advanced all of these disputed claims. In the ensuing months, Liberty finally gave in to mounting pressure and demoted Connor due to, as they put it, discrepancies related to matters such as dates, names, and places of residence. But here's the thing, the Connor brothers were not the only fake ex-Muslim terrorists, not at all. Together, Walid Shobat, Zachariah Anani, and Kamal Salim formed their own separate traveling anti-Muslim sideshow. Shobat, a Palestinian-American evangelical convert, claimed to have been a member of the PLO and to have bombed an Israeli bank. Anani, a Lebanese-born Canadian, claimed to have joined a militia at the age of 13, trained to become a black belt and an expert with daggers and knives, and he claimed to have killed hundreds of people before meeting a Southern Baptist missionary and getting saved. It was Salim's story, however, that was so remarkable that one journalist dubbed him the Forrest Gump of the Middle East. Born in Lebanon, he claimed to have been recruited by the PLO and the Muslim Brotherhood and touted as a model warrior by Yasser Arafat himself. He then moved to America to wage cultural jihad on the United States, and he went to the Bible Belt, the American South, so he could take on the best of the best. Instead, he became an evangelical, and he decided to spread the good news of Christianity and the horrifying, terrifying news of the Islamic threat. These things went hand in hand. It was in this role that he came to my university, Calvin University, where my colleague, Doug Howard, who happens to be an expert in Ottoman history, heard Salim refer to himself as a descendant of the Grand Wazir of Islam. Now, Howard knew there is no such thing as a Grand Wazir. And so he got a little curious and he started doing some research, and he learned that Salim's real name was Kodar Shami, that he had worked for Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network, CBN, for 16 years, and in 2003 had joined the staff at Focus on the Family. Howard then contacted Jim Daly, president of Focus on the Family, in the fall of 2007. Now, Focus on the Family had been very actively promoting an anti-Islamic agenda as part of its ministry. So Howard was surprised to learn that they too had become skeptical of Salim's claims, not only his claims of his violent terrorist past, but also his claim to have kicked a game-winning field goal for the Oklahoma Sooners. He had never, in fact, played football for the Sooners. However, they had not gone public with this information, nor were they eager to do so. The narratives of Anani and Shobot did not hold up any better. In the words of a former Canadian security expert, Anani was, quote, not an individual who rates the slightest degree of credibility. As for Shobot, he had a secular upbringing and there was no record of him ever bombing a bank, among other things. The most extreme thing that he had ever done, according to Doug Howard, was attaching Palestinian flag stickers to utility poles around town. But all three continued to be sought after authorities in evangelical circles, speaking at conferences, at Christian colleges such as my own, at churches, on Christian radio and television. In 2008, they spoke at the Air Force Academy at Colorado Springs. Now, their popularity casts in stark relief the dynamics of an evangelical politics of fear. They presented and promoted a pornography of violence. They told completely fabricated stories of the horrific violence that Muslims wanted to do to Americans and especially to American Christians. In doing so, they dehumanized Muslims while goading Americans and especially American Christians to respond with violence of their own. With books like Why We Want to Kill You, they positioned American Christians as the victims, potential victims, imminent victims, and then therefore justified an extreme response. They invented their stories. What did it get them? A lot of money, right? They made a lot of money on the speaking circuit, selling books. When you sell 200,000 copies of a book, you make a few royalties. But what did it get the evangelicals who promoted them, the evangelicals who propped them up, who convinced them to write these books, who arranged their speaking gigs, who employed them at their organizations and institutions? What did it get them? Stoking fear in the hearts of American Christians played into the hands of conservative evangelical leaders. It enhanced their own power by ratcheting up a sense of threat, by stoking fears in the hearts of their followers. They elevated their own position as protectors and defenders, and this tactic only worked within a militarized framework. And when I saw this, it clicked for me. When I was first kind of baffled by this, like the fraudulent ex-Muslim terrorists. Seriously, but this was a really big deal. I mean, I saw these books on the bookshelves of people I knew well in the early 2000s, and I heard how it shaped their view and absolutely fed their fear of Islam and absolutely shaped their views on American foreign policy. And this is when it really clicked for me, the question, what actually came first? Evangelical militancy or fear? Because the standard narrative was that evangelical militancy was a result of fears of communists, fears of feminists, fears of secular humanists, fears of liberals, fears of Muslims. And then I started to see, at least among leaders, it seemed like we needed to flip the script, that the militancy came first and that fear needed to be stoked in order to sustain that militancy. And I had seen this in evangelical churches, in Jerry Falwell Sr.'s Thomas Road Baptist Church, in Jack Hyles's Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, in Mark Driscoll's Evangelical Megachurch. The practice of pastors instilling fear in the hearts of their followers, fear of bad theology, fear of other churches, fear of any other, so that their followers would continue to come to them for protection, trust them, give money to them. And this applied to the the organizations of the religious right more broadly as well. Now, I started this talk saying that I did not set out to write about Islamophobia. It just so happened that so many of the men that I was already tracking who were writing about God-ordained militant Christian manhood were the very same men who started stoking this Islamophobia in the post 9/11 years. When I first started writing this book, also, I had an interesting conversation with an editor who was interested in publishing this work. And after he read my proposal, read my manuscript, not the full manuscript, just the summary, he said, you know, Kristin, I think what you have here is actually a new history of American evangelicalism. And at that point, I said, no, 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 no. I am not setting out to write that at all. This is a much more narrow study. It is simply a history of white evangelical masculinity and militarism. I am not interested in writing a new history of evangelicalism. And I actually decided to go with a different editor, a different publisher, because I thought, yeah, we're not really seeing the same thing here. About 3 months into the writing process for you, when I was sitting down and actually writing this book, all of a sudden it dawned on me. I think I'm writing a new history of evangelicalism. And this question is really at the heart of it. You know, what came first, fear or militancy? And if we put militancy first, suddenly the history of white evangelicalism looks quite different. And that also applies to white evangelical support for Donald Trump in 2016. Popular narratives suggested that evangelicals were really backed into a corner. They were so afraid and they had no choice but to hold their noses and back this unconventional Republican candidate. If you put militancy first, and if you understand this long history of an embrace of a militant Christian manhood, one that draws much more on secular impulses and symbols than on biblical values, one that embraces strength and aggression and even violence for the cause of righteousness, then suddenly there's not a lot of mystery in understanding evangelicals' support for a person like Donald Trump. This is not a betrayal of evangelicals. In many ways, we really need to see this as the fulfillment of those values. And so that's where this ended up. And understanding the role of Islamophobia in evangelicalism was really kind of the key to unlocking that narrative. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Du Mez. That is an amazing narrative and gives us such a context to approach a very difficult subject of Islamophobia, and breaking it down, deconstructing it, looking at the background and the causes, the academic side, and then making sense in the present world. I'm just going to quickly ask one question because I see we have two there, and that will give people time to type up some questions. And what was really striking to me is how the white evangelical males, the examples you were giving, use this very violent rhetoric to vilify Islam, while on the other hand, they use militant or violent rhetoric to validate their Christianity or militant Christianity.
Yeah.
And your arguments are so sound, make complete sense to me. I'm wondering, have you been confronted or have you had any dialogue with people who hold these views, and what are their responses? I mean, has that happened?
What's interesting to me is so I could talk about the book in general, and the book has been out for 4 months now. And the response among evangelicals has been astonishing to me, in that it has been just incredibly enthusiastically received by the people who are telling me what they think. So, right, I don't want to say that everybody loves it, but there has been very little pushback. I'm not quite sure how to understand that, except that I think maybe the strategy is better to ignore than provoke. But also, I think that this is a work of history, with a lot of evidence, a lot of footnotes, and a lot of it is just pretty indisputable narrative. And so I think it's holding up well in that regard. I will say that, I mean, I find the Islamophobia chapter and my chapter on the embrace of the military really critical. And those chapters are not often discussed in reviews yet. And I think it's simply because in the United States right now, so much attention is laser focused on the election. And so the ways in which the book helps us understand white evangelical support for Donald Trump as not at all, it just makes absolutely perfect sense. And so that's really where a lot of the focus is. But I think that if, a historical event happens, God forbid, and Middle Eastern wars is back, in January when we almost went to war with Iran, it seemed, that would have moved it back into this space. So I think right now there's distraction. So no, I haven't gotten any pushback. I do know that so many conservative evangelicals deeply believe that this is an imminent threat to Christianity and to America. So I imagine there's a lot of people who might want to push back, but they might also be fascinating to learn of the falsehoods behind that. I don't know how they would respond to that.
Right. Great. Thank you very much. I'm just going to check with Monique and see if we have some questions that you could read out, Monique, for Dr. Du Mez.
Yes, we have several questions. So our first one is, a lot of this reminds me of show debates between conversos, both Jewish and Islamic, and Jews or Muslims, following the forced conversions in the Spanish Empire of the 16th century. The situation seems similar in that former insiders were enlisted to demonize their former colleagues. Have you considered any deeper history analogies and anything they might help us understand about how these things might play out?
Oh, that is so fascinating and shows the kind of department that I'm speaking to right now. So the short answer is no. Again, I kind of stumbled across this because I was not intending in any way to write about Islamophobia or to, the only thing that led me to them is just following the trails of the guys that were already writing about masculinity. And so many of them were also promoting this. So I was really examining it in that framework, not the longer history of Islamophobia. And if I were going to do more of the longer history, I just mentioned very briefly in passing Christian Zionism, right? That would have to be center stage here as well. Prophecy teachings in different Protestant traditions. And again, I thought that really interesting moment in the 1990s on the persecution of the global church was really fascinating. Melanie McAllister has a phenomenal book on that, which demonstrates how this, seemingly kind of selfless cause of supporting global Christians ended up being used rhetorically to position privileged and dominant white American Christians as victims. And so it really was used to enhance their power. And so it's really interesting how that works in the kind of cultural and religious discourse. All of which is to say, no, I have not looked into that longer history.
Okay, Monique, is there another question coming?
Yes, yeah, we have a few more. So, have you read Margaret Mcmillan's new book on war? And do you see connections with your history?
No, I have not. So I have been, I will say that I wrote this book in 18 months. And so it was an incredibly intense 18 months, and it was all I could do to finish this. And so I thought by this point in time, I would be catching up on a lot of different readings, and so many phenomenal books are coming out right now, and I've got them stacked in my office. And thus far, I've still just been spending every spare moment giving interviews until the election is done. So I have not, I cannot make comparisons there.
Okay, so another one here. How have you seen white evangelical militarism and fear spread to broader American or Western culture?
Yeah, that is a really good question. Because one of the things that I trace through this book is the affinities across religious difference, and the unities around cultural identity. And so you see the connections, particularly between secular conservatives and conservative white evangelicals. And that's actually kind of what the title of my book is getting at too, the Jesus and John Wayne phenomenon, where it was a model of secular masculinity. John Wayne was not an evangelical, did not live according to biblical values, but he was a symbol for this rugged militant masculinity. And secular conservatives loved him. And in time, he became a symbol of Christian manhood for conservative evangelicals as well. And so you see this unity across, theological difference, Christians, not Christians, in the extreme, and but this affinity in terms of cultural identity and cultural values, particularly militant masculinity and militarism. And so there's a lot of back and forth. It's a very porous boundary. In fact, it's hard to even detect a boundary. So white evangelicals tend to not trust the mainstream media, and this has been going on for decades. And so they will kind of live in their own media bubble, Christian media, but also Fox News and secular talk radio, right? And so you have this, one feeds into the other and back and forth. And same thing between conservative evangelicals and the Republican Party. So they really work in tandem, and it's hard to kind of separate them out. So Oliver North, who's writing for Christian publishers, and he's on in the evangelical speaking circuit. He's also a Fox News commentator, and that's how this works, kind of going back and forth, and it's really very seamless. So yes, the influence goes both ways, and it's really amplified in that way, and that's how it becomes so politically powerful and so unifying. And you absolutely see that working itself out right now, embracing not just Trump's politics, but this kind of militant white nationalism. You see unifying conservative evangelicals and conservative Americans generally.
All right. So our next one here, do you have any idea what damage this rhetoric has done as an influence on American foreign policy, for example, in US-Iranian relations?
I mean, I can't say specifically, but I can't imagine that it hasn't done a lot of damage. And one of the things that has been most concerning to me, so it's not just the rhetoric, but this has infiltrated the military. And so I have a chapter I just alluded to on Colorado Springs. So you have the Air Force Academy situated right across the street from Dobson's Focus on the Family and Ted Haggard's New Life Church. And first of all, Dobson had been working since the 1980s in tandem with the US military to bring his family values politics into the military. So the entire military had distributed one of his videos, and they scrubbed a little bit of the religious stuff out, but the whole ideology was intact. And so they were trying to instill family values throughout the U.S. military. And then he would bring military officials onto his show and really try to prop up the military as noble and honorable in the wake of the Vietnam debacle. And so they are working in tandem for decades. Dobson's focus on the family and the U.S. military. And then with the Air Force Academy right there, they are busing members of New Life Church and focus on the family types into the academy for Bible study every week. And then what we see happening, Mickey Weinstein wrote a book about this. He demonstrates how this evangelical warrior rhetoric gets embraced by the military. And so he had been at the academy a couple decades earlier, and there was none of this like rah, kill people, this kind of bloodlust language at all. And I'd been completely taken over by this Christian warrior language. And you have here again, you have this kind of revolving door between the military and evangelical leaders, and military figures are writing devotionals and evangelicals are joining the military. And it is absolutely shaping military. I can't point to specific policies, but you could see a lot of similarities then. And you also, actually you can, I can point to Jerry Boykin would be a prime example. And I have a whole section on the book of what he ends up doing, taking terror tactics from Guantanamo and bring him to the Abu Ghraib situation. And so, yes, it's deeply connected in really the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. So it's profound. It's really significant, and it's somewhat surprising to me that people have tried to bring attention to this in little flashpoints, but there's a long narrative here that a lot of people just aren't really aware of.
You definitely touched on the next question here with the answer to that last question, and this is, where do you think the evangelical influence on the military may be going?
Yeah. So it's this God and country patriotism is so deeply ingrained in evangelicalism, and the militarism is that it's almost perceived as sacrilege if you question, in any way, militarism, U.S. Military engagement in any particular situation. It's hard to see that eroding. It's just so deeply ingrained. You'll have the flag in front of church, and you'll have 4th of July and Memorial Day, and all these are kind of sacred Christian holidays, and a real conflation of religion and militarism. That said, the actions of President Trump with regard to the military have perhaps a bit of a destabilizing effect. It's really hard to tell. In that Trump has attacked generals, has attacked military leadership, and has support from many rank and file because of his embrace of militarism, but does not have the respect of many members of the military. And so I think there are some divisions there, and I'm not quite sure how those would play out in evangelical circles, in part because they haven't really broke the surface, but that's something that I've been watching since even before Trump took office, because I think anybody who has concerns about perhaps his authoritarian tendencies should be looking particularly at his relationship with the military. And so that's something that I've paid attention to since he was just a candidate. And I actually have taken some comfort in the fact that he really likes to criticize certain generals who can't get the job done like he thinks that they ought to be able to do, with a lot of shock and awe, and just get it done and win and be out. Yeah.
All right. So our next one here is, will China phobia be the next tool to shore up male Christians?
Yeah. I mean, it seemed like he was going in that direction. I didn't see that take hold quite in the same way because I think the Chinese have not been depicted as these bloodthirsty enemies. They are more of an economic threat, and they are simply conflated with communism. And so that like pulls these you know, older Cold War motifs of communism. They're bad and we can oppose them, but I haven't seen the same kind of militarism focused around China. It really is at this point still an economic concern and just trying to kind of beat them, and that will be done through influence more than with the military. Anything could spark a change there, but I haven't yet seen that certainly not take hold within evangelical circles. I mean, they'll say they don't like China because they gave us the China virus, you know, in their words, but I haven't seen it spark the same kind of militarism as we saw with Islam and still see.
All right. So one of your early comments had me expecting you to talk about the non-warrior nature of Jesus. Could you comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I could have a lot to say about that. And so, you know, there's what's really interesting, and this is kind of the part of the subtitle of my book, the corrupted of faith part. Because yes, there's a lot of this within these teachings that do in fact contradict some pretty core teachings of the Christian scriptures. And so, you know, particularly loving your neighbor as yourself, loving your enemies, turning the other cheek, the fruits of the spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, right? All these things do not really make for a very militant masculinity or a very militant faith when you think about it. And that is why conservative evangelicals weren't quoting the Bible a whole lot when it came to crafting this militant masculinity. And instead, they were looking outside of Christian tradition to these mythical warriors, to like Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart, to cowboys and soldiers and General Patton and MacArthur, and to John Wayne, right? So they were looking like outside of Christian tradition because they really needed men who had not been formed through traditional Christian virtue. And so that is absolutely something that I talk about in the book. But then what they end up doing is recasting Christ in that image. And so Jesus is this warrior Christ with a tattoo down his leg, who rides his steed, you know, carrying a sword into a bloody battle and slays all his enemies. And so they changed the Christ of the Christian scriptures into precisely this image that they've already created. And so that's kind of the much of the book is fairly objective history, you know, lots of documentation, but there is a critical framing there, and that's what the subtitle is pointing to.
Great. We have time for one more question, I think.
Okay, sounds good. So what is your view on the evangelical and Catholic collaboration, for example, in the journal First Things?
Oh, yes. Oh, do I really have to talk about the journal First Things? So I'll go back further in history first. And yes, you see that absolutely is critical to understanding the rise of the religious right, and this Catholic Evangelical alliance that forms in the 1960s, in particular around precisely the issues I was talking about. I think I mentioned Phyllis Schlafly just in passing. She's a Catholic. Sometimes I consider her an honorary evangelical because she's so influential in evangelical circles with regard to gender and foreign policy from the 1960s up until her death in 2016. And what we see are evangelicals and Catholics uniting around these kind of family values issues, particularly abortion, whereas in the 1960s, even as recently as the 1960s, many evangelicals were not pro-life as they are today because they considered it a Catholic issue, and they did not like Catholics. And so really it's in the 1970s that we see this alliance start to form, and it's not just around abortion, but within Catholicism too. We see, I mean, all these issues of the religious right, and it's really politics and cultural values that end up unifying conservative Catholics and evangelicals, white Catholics and white evangelicals around these culture wars issues. So that's very much a story. I kept an eye as I was researching this book. I mean, the book ended up, started narrow strand, ended up a new history of evangelicalism. So I was trying to still keep it manageable, but I had an eye on white Catholics and conservative Catholics during this time. And I have friends who study that. And so I would check in with them, and they'd check in with me. And yes, we see much of the same kind of ideology taking hold. And there's a lot of cross-fertilization. I think particularly at the level of leadership. So like the Journal of First Things within these organizations, political organizations of the religious right, lobbying organizations, and so on. That's where you see a lot of the partnership. At the popular level, I think there still is more separation, different religious communities. Certainly, they're consuming different cultural products. And for the way that my methodology, that was significant. And so where they might be ending in the same point, we don't have a lot of conservative white Catholics reading Wild at Heart, certainly not as many. And they're not listening to the same radio station necessarily. And so there's more separation there. But we absolutely are seeing in the last 50 years, the cultural and political alliance, which is then, bringing conservative Catholics and evangelicals closer together and dividing them from progressive Catholics, progressive evangelicals, respectively. So this is a kind of restructuring of American religion that sociologists talk about.
Great. Well, thank you so much to the audience for these wonderful questions, and Dr. Du Mez for answering them so thoroughly. I do apologize that we haven't been able to get through all the questions, but the good news is that on Saturday, those of you who didn't get your questions through, I hope you can join us for the next lecture, public lecture that Dr. Du Mez will be giving, the Chair of Christian Thought, Owaza lecture on urban theology that looks at Jesus and John Wayne, the book that has been addressed here tonight and in further detail. But because I can unmute myself as I'm speaking, I want to do one thing that the rest of the audience can't do, and I'm sure they want to do. And I want to applaud you and thank you very much for your talk tonight. And we will see you again very soon.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Du Mez. And thank you, Monique and Courtney. Good night, everybody.